The rain was still falling when Michael Franke bled out in an Oregon Department of Corrections parking lot on the 17th of January, 1989. His briefcase scattered reform documents across the wet asphalt like broken promises, and within hours the truth began to die with him. For 34 years, a mother named Grace Halbrook watched her town bury lies deeper than bodies, saw an innocent man convicted on fabricated testimony, and lost her own son to the shadows of a cover-up that reached the highest levels of state government. But when a rusted keyring finally unlocked the past, it revealed a conspiracy so deep that it would destroy careers, overturn convictions, and prove that sometimes justice isn't just delayed, it's deliberately murdered. What happens when the people sworn to protect truth become its executioners? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Dusk settled over Salem like a gray blanket on the 17th of January, 1989. The Oregon Department of Corrections headquarters stood silent against the misting rain, its parking lot empty except for a few scattered cars. Inside the building, fluorescent lights hummed over empty desks, while one man worked late into the evening. Michael Franke sat hunched over his desk, reading through file after file. The new director of corrections had made enemies quickly. His reform agenda threatened people who'd grown comfortable with the old ways of doing business. Tonight, those files told a story that would shake the foundation of Oregon's prison system. Kickbacks, falsified reports, drugs smuggled through security checkpoints. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. Franke glanced at his watch. Past 9 o'clock, he gathered the documents into his briefcase, knowing he'd need to present this evidence carefully. Lives depended on getting this right. As he prepared to leave, he noticed two men in dark suits near the stairwell, their voices low and urgent. Something about their presence made his stomach tighten. The security guard made his rounds, footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Everything seemed normal. Franke locked his office and walked toward the exit, briefcase heavy with secrets that powerful people wanted to keep buried. 20 minutes later, the same security guard found Franke's body slumped beside his car. Blood pooled beneath him, mixing with Oregon rain. His briefcase lay open, documents scattered across the wet pavement. The glass door to the building hung ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The guard's radio crackled as he called for help, but Michael Franke was already beyond saving. What he'd discovered in those files had cost him everything. Salem's quiet night had been shattered by the sound of justice being murdered. Grace Halbrook woke to sirens on the morning of the 18th of January. She set down her coffee cup still warm and turned on the radio. The news anchor's voice carried gravity that made her stomach drop. Oregon Department of Corrections Director Michael Franke was found dead last night in the agency's parking lot. Police are investigating what appears to be a robbery gone wrong. Grace's 22-year-old son Jonah appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face pale. He worked as a clerk at DOC headquarters, filing reports and organizing documents. Simple work that paid the bills while he figured out his future. "Mom?" Jonah's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I was there yesterday. I saw him working late." The radio continued its report. Politicians promised swift justice. The community was urged to remain calm while investigators did their work. But Grace noticed something in her son's eyes, a fear that hadn't been there yesterday. "What did you see?" she asked gently. Jonah shook his head, moving to the window. Outside, neighbors gathered on porches, their faces drawn with shock. Salem wasn't the kind of place where reform-minded state officials got murdered. This was a town where people knew each other, where corruption stayed hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. "Nothing," Jonah said, but his hands trembled as he poured coffee. "I didn't see nothing." Grace watched her son carefully. In 22 years, she'd learned to read his moods. This wasn't grief for a deceased boss. This was terror. The radio crackled with updates. No suspects yet. Investigation ongoing. The community was asked to come forward with any information. Grace looked at Jonah's shaking hands and wondered what information her son might be hiding. 2 days later, gray clouds hung over Salem Community Church as the town gathered for Michael Franke's funeral. Grace wore her black dress, the same one she'd worn to her husband's service 5 years earlier. Beside her, Jonah sat rigid in his suit, eyes scanning the crowd like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. The church overflowed with mourners. State officials filled the front pews, their faces appropriately somber. DOC employees clustered together, whispering among themselves. Grace recognized most of them from company picnics and holiday parties Jonah had brought her to. But today, watching them during the service, she noticed things she'd missed before. How certain officials avoided eye contact with each other. The way Deputy Director Clive Mercer kept checking his watch. Warden Victor Holloway's practiced expression of grief that never quite reached his eyes. Michael Franke believed in justice, the pastor said from the pulpit. He came to Oregon to clean house, to make our corrections system something we could be proud of. His work was far from finished. Grace felt Jonah flinch beside her at those words. His breathing had grown shallow, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. When she reached for his hand, she found it ice cold. During the hymn, a man in a dark suit approached their pew. Grace had never seen him before, but the way he looked at Jonah sent chills down her spine. The stranger didn't speak, just placed a firm hand on Jonah's shoulder and squeezed, a warning disguised as comfort. After the service, as mourners filed past Frankie's casket, Grace overheard fragments of conversation. Such a shame. Random violence. Wrong place, wrong time. The official story was already taking shape, neat and simple. But Grace had seen the fear in her son's eyes. She'd watched powerful men avoid each other's gaze. Nothing about Michael Frankie's death felt random. That evening, Grace sat in her living room watching the local news. The anchor's polished voice filled the quiet house as images of the crime scene flashed across the screen. Police continue investigating what they believe was a botched car burglary that resulted in the tragic death of corrections director Michael Frankie. Sources close to the investigation suggest the perpetrator was likely looking for valuables when surprised by Frankie's return to his vehicle. Grace gripped the television remote tighter. The story felt rehearsed, too clean for something as messy as murder. She'd lived in Salem long enough to know how things really worked. When powerful people wanted a story told a certain way, that's how it got told. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, picking at the dinner she'd made. He'd barely spoken since the funeral, jumping at every unexpected sound. When the phone rang, he nearly knocked over his chair. "It's probably Mrs. Henderson from next door," Grace said, but Jonah was already on his feet, pacing. "They're saying it was random," he said suddenly, his voice cracking. "On the news. They're saying it was just bad luck." "What do you think it was?" Grace asked carefully. Jonah stopped pacing, his back to her. For a long moment, the only sound was the television anchor moving on to weather reports. Finally, her son turned around, and Grace saw something that broke her heart, the look of a man who'd witnessed something terrible and had nowhere to run. "Mr. Frankie had files," Jonah whispered. "Important files. He was asking questions that made people nervous." "What kind of questions?" But Jonah was already walking toward his room, shoulders sagging with a weight too heavy for his young frame. At the doorway, he paused. "If something happens to me, Mom, don't believe what they tell you." The next morning, at DOC headquarters, Jonah tried to blend into the background. The building felt different now, charged with tension, and whispered conversations that stopped when he walked by. In the break room, he overheard Deputy Director Mercer talking to Warden Holloway in hushed tones. "The investigation needs to stay focused," Mercer was saying. "Random crime. Don't let them start digging into administrative matters." Holloway nodded. "The boys downtown understand the situation. This won't become a fishing expedition." Jonah pretended to make coffee while listening. These weren't grieving colleagues discussing a fallen friend. These were men managing a crisis, controlling information. He thought about the files he'd seen on Frankie's desk just days ago, documents with official seals, names highlighted in yellow marker, phone numbers written in margins. Later that afternoon, Jonah watched maintenance workers wheel out boxes of shredded paper. Memos that had been on Frankie's desk were now confetti, destroyed so thoroughly that not even fragments remained. But in his haste to clear his own small desk, someone had missed a half-torn page wedged behind a filing cabinet. Jonah palmed it quickly, his heart racing. The letterhead showed DOC official stationery, and at the bottom, barely visible, were the initials MF in Frankie's careful handwriting. Above that, a list of names, some he recognized as senior corrections officials. That evening at dinner, Grace noticed her son's hands shaking as he passed the salt. "Jonah, you're scaring me." He looked up from his untouched plate, eyes filled with something that made Grace's blood run cold. "Mom, if I disappear, if something happens and I'm not here anymore, you need to know they killed him. It wasn't random, and there are people who know that, people who are covering it up right now." Grace reached across the table, but Jonah pulled away. "Promise me you won't give up looking if I have to run." 2 nights later, Jonah came home after midnight. Grace heard his key in the lock and met him at the door. His face was white as paper, and his clothes were soaked through with rain. "Where have you been?" she asked, but he just wrapped his arms around her tightly, holding on like a drowning man. "I love you, Mom," he whispered into her shoulder. "I need you to remember that, no matter what happens next." He spent the rest of the night at the kitchen table, writing. Grace watched from the doorway as page after page filled with his careful handwriting. Documents scattered around him, some she recognized from his work, others she'd never seen before. Every few minutes, he'd look toward the window, as if expecting someone to be watching. "Jonah, talk to me. What's happening?" But he just kept writing, occasionally stopping to wipe tears from his eyes. At 4 a.m, he finally gathered all the pages together and sealed them in an envelope. On the front, he wrote, "For Mom," in shaking letters. "I have to go," he said, standing up. "They know I saw something that night. They know I have copies of documents that could hurt important people." "What documents? What did you see?" Jonah kissed her forehead gently. "I saw who really killed Michael Franke, and I saw them cover it up. That makes me a problem they need to solve." He went to his room and returned with a small bag already packed. The envelope sat on the kitchen table between them like an unexploded bomb. "Don't open it unless something happens to me," he said, "and if it does happen, don't let them convince you I was crazy or on drugs or making things up. Everything in there is real." By dawn, Jonah was gone. Grace found his note on the pillow. "Mom, I can't be here when the truth comes out." Grace filed a missing person report that same morning, but the officer behind the desk seemed uninterested. "Young men ran away all the time," he explained. "Stress from work, relationship problems, maybe drugs. These things usually resolve themselves within a few days." "My son doesn't use drugs," Grace said firmly, "and he wouldn't just leave without telling me where he was going." The officer, a tired-looking man named Sergeant Mills, barely looked up from his paperwork. "Ma'am, your son is 22 years old, legally an adult, unless you have evidence of foul play. His boss was murdered a week ago." Jonah was acting terrified. "That's not normal behavior." Mills finally met her eyes. "Mrs. Halbrook, I understand you're worried, but the Franke case is being handled by state investigators. It's not connected to your son's decision to leave town." Grace felt the familiar frustration of not being taken seriously. She'd experienced it when her husband died young, when insurance companies tried to deny his claims, when bureaucrats explained why they couldn't help. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. She spent the day calling Jonah's friends, checking bus stations and motels within a 50-mile radius. No one had seen him. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. That evening, Grace sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the envelope Jonah had left behind. His handwriting on the front looked rushed, desperate. Inside were his final words, explanations she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The local news played in the background, updating viewers on the Franke investigation. Still no suspects. Still treating it as a random crime. The reporter mentioned that the victim's replacement had already been chosen, a veteran corrections official who promised to maintain stability during this difficult transition. Grace looked at the envelope again. Her son was missing, and the man he'd worked for was dead. Stability was the last thing Salem needed right now. 1 week later, Salem tried to return to normal. The crime scene tape was gone, and employees returned to work at DOC headquarters. But Grace noticed the changes: how people whispered more than before, how certain officials seemed nervous when approached by reporters, how quickly conversations ended when she walked by. She returned to the DOC building under the pretense of collecting Jonah's personal belongings from his desk. Deputy Director Mercer escorted her personally, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Such a tragedy about your son," he said as they walked through corridors that felt colder than before. "Young people sometimes need space to figure things out. I'm sure he'll be in touch soon." Jonah's desk had been cleaned out already, but Grace was thorough in her search. In the bottom drawer, wedged behind the metal frame, she found something the cleaners had missed: a half-shredded memo on DOC letterhead. The fragment was small, but she could make out enough words to understand its significance. "Recommends immediate investigation into irregularities." And at the bottom, barely visible, "M.F. Grace," palmed the fragment quickly, her heart racing. Mercer was watching her closely, but she kept her expression neutral. "Find everything you need?" he asked. "Yes, thank you." Grace managed a weak smile. Jonah didn't keep much personal stuff here. As they walked back toward the exit, Grace noticed something else: the way certain employees avoided eye contact with Mercer. The way conversations stopped when he approached. Fear had settled over the building like a heavy blanket. That night, Grace sat at her kitchen table with the memo fragment spread before her. It wasn't much, but it was something. Physical evidence that Michael Franke had been investigating problems within his own department. Problems serious enough to kill for. She tucked the fragment inside her Bible, whispering a promise to the empty house. "I'll find you, Jonah, and I'll find the truth." The months blended together like watercolors in rain. 1989 became 1990, then 1991. Grace aged quietly, her hair gaining silver threads as Salem moved forward without her. The town tried to heal from Michael Franke's murder, but the wound festered beneath the surface. DOC headquarters expanded, adding new wings and hiring fresh faces. Most people seemed eager to forget the violence that had shattered their sense of safety. Grace was not most people. She collected fragments like a detective: newspaper clippings, archived radio broadcasts, copies of public records. Her kitchen table became a command center covered with manila folders and spiral notebooks. Every lead, no matter how small, got written down in her careful handwriting. Letters went out monthly to state senators, newspaper editors, and the governor's office. Most went unanswered. The few responses she received were form letters, expressing sympathy and promising that appropriate authorities were handling the matter. Grace's correspondence box grew thick with rejections and silence. But she kept writing, kept asking questions, kept pushing for answers that seemed to slip further away with each passing month. Her neighbors worried about her. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought casseroles and gentle suggestions that maybe it was time to accept that Jonah had chosen to start fresh somewhere else. Young men did that sometimes, she said. The world was big, and Salem could feel small to someone with dreams. But Grace knew her son. Jonah wouldn't abandon her without word, wouldn't disappear, unless he had no choice. Every night, she set 2 places at the dinner table, and waited by the window until darkness fell. Hope was the cruelest companion, but she couldn't let it go. By Christmas of 1993, Grace had filled 6 notebooks with observations, theories, and unanswered questions. The truth about Michael Francke's murder remained buried, and her son remained missing. But she wasn't ready to surrender. April 1994 brought unexpected news that changed everything. Grace was having coffee at Murphy's Diner when the television above the counter erupted with breaking news. In a major development in the Michael Frankke murder case, police have arrested 31-year-old Frank Gable, a transient with a history of drug-related offenses. Gable is being charged with aggravated murder in connection with the 1989 death of the state corrections director. Grace's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Around the diner, conversations stopped as patrons turned toward the screen. The reporter continued with details about Gable's criminal background and his alleged connection to the crime. Sources close to the investigation say Gable confessed to killing Frankke during a botched robbery attempt. The arrest comes after years of intensive investigation by state police. Grace felt her world tilt sideways. This was wrong, she knew it in her bones. The man on screen looked nothing like the sophisticated killers her instincts told her had murdered Frank. Gable appeared broken, defeated, exactly the kind of person who could be convinced to confess to anything. She drove directly to the courthouse, clutching Jonah's photo against her chest. Reporters swarmed the building, interviewing anyone willing to comment on the arrest. Grace listened from the edges of the crowd as officials praised the thoroughness of the investigation. Justice has been served, District Attorney Morrison announced. The citizens of Salem can rest assured that Michael Francke's killer has been brought to account. But Grace couldn't rest assured. She studied Gable's photograph in the newspaper later that day. Hollow eyes, hollow cheeks, the look of someone who'd been worn down by life. This was someone's scapegoat, not their killer. That evening, Grace added a new folder to her collection. Frank Gable went on the cover in her careful handwriting. Below it, she wrote her first note. They needed someone to blame. The trial began 6 months later, in a courtroom packed with spectators and media. Grace attended every day, sitting in the back row with a notebook balanced on her knees. What she witnessed there convinced her that Salem's justice system was as broken as she'd feared. The prosecution's case relied heavily on jailhouse informants, men who claimed Gable had confessed to them while awaiting trial. Their testimonies were detailed and dramatic, but Grace noticed the inconsistencies. Stories that changed between hearings, motivations that didn't make sense, witnesses who seemed more interested in reducing their own sentences than telling the truth. Gable told me he went there to rob cars. One informant testified, said Frankke surprised him, so he had to kill him. But Grace had done her homework. She knew Frankke's briefcase had been found open with documents scattered around the scene. What car thief stops to rifle through official papers? What random criminal knows exactly which files to target? The defense attorney seemed overwhelmed, outgunned by prosecutors who painted Gable as a violent drifter who'd killed for pocket change. Physical evidence was minimal, a few fibers, some circumstantial connections. The case hung entirely on informant testimony from criminals hoping for deals. Grace watched the jury's faces throughout the trial. They wanted closure, wanted to believe that justice was being served. The idea that state officials might be involved in covering up their colleague's murder was too disturbing to accept. Michael Francke's brothers attended the trial too, sitting near the front with expressions of quiet doubt. During breaks, Grace overheard them discussing the inconsistencies, questioning whether Gable was really guilty or just convenient. On the day of closing arguments, Grace held her breath as prosecutors painted their final picture of guilt. The defense did their best with limited resources and hostile witnesses, but the outcome felt predetermined. When the jury foreman stood to announce their verdict, Grace already knew what he would say. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Grace watched Frank Gable's face crumple as reporters scrambled for their cameras, and spectators erupted in mixed reactions. Some cheered for justice served, others sat in stunned silence. Grace felt no satisfaction, only a hollow ache that spread through her chest. This wasn't justice, this was theater. A performance designed to give Salem the closure it desperately wanted, while protecting the people who really knew what happened that night in 1989. Outside the courthouse, politicians gave interviews about the successful prosecution. District Attorney Morrison praised the dedication of investigators and the courage of witnesses who'd come forward. The message was clear. The case was closed. The community could move forward. The nightmare was over. But Grace's nightmare was just beginning. That evening, she sat alone in her kitchen while neighbors celebrated the verdict with backyard gatherings and raised glasses. Mrs. Henderson knocked on her door with a chocolate cake and well-meaning advice. "You can put this behind you now, dear," she said kindly. "With Frankie's killer caught, maybe Jonah will feel safe enough to come home." Grace accepted the cake with a weak smile, but she knew the truth. Frank Gable's conviction didn't make Salem safer. It made the real killers more secure. They'd successfully pinned their crime on a man who couldn't fight back, who had no resources to challenge their narrative. She pulled out a fresh notebook that night and wrote "Frank Gable Trial" on the cover. Below it, she added her assessment: "Innocent man convicted, real killers still free." On the mantel above her fireplace, Grace arranged 3 photographs in a row: Michael Franke from a newspaper clipping, Jonah from his high school graduation, and Frank Gable from his arrest photo. 3 men whose lives had been destroyed by the same corruption that Salem refused to acknowledge. "This isn't over," she whispered to their silent faces. Not by a long shot. The late 1990s brought changes to Salem that Grace watched with growing unease. DOC headquarters expanded again, its parking lot filled with newer cars, and its hallways bustling with confident bureaucrats who'd never known Michael Frank. The building where her son once worked had been scrubbed clean of its bloody history. Grace continued her ritual visits to the old section of the complex, now used primarily for storage. Security was lax in the forgotten corners of the building, and she'd learned which doors were usually unlocked and which guards were too busy to notice an older woman wandering the corridors. During one such visit, Grace made her way to the cramped office, where Jonah had once filed reports and organized documents. The space had been converted to storage, filled with boxes of old records and outdated equipment. But Grace remembered exactly where his desk had been positioned. She knelt beside what remained of the old furniture, running her fingers along the metal edges until she found what she was looking for. Carved into the underside of a drawer, barely visible, were Jonah's initials. JH 1989, scratched with what must have been a paperclip or penknife. The discovery broke her heart and strengthened her resolve in equal measure. Her son had left this small mark of his existence, proof that he'd been here, that he'd mattered. Grace traced the letters with her finger, imagining Jonah as a young man with his whole life ahead of him, never knowing he'd witness something that would force him to run. She spent 20 minutes alone in that dusty room, surrounded by the ghosts of bureaucracy and remembering better days. When footsteps echoed in the corridor, she slipped out quietly, carrying the memory of those carved initials like a sacred trust. That night, Grace added another entry to her journals. Jonah was here. He existed. He mattered. Below it, she wrote a promise: "I'm not done searching." The new millennium brought fresh disappointments, and one unexpected surprise. Grace had sent hundreds of letters over the years to officials, journalists, and advocacy groups. Most disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, or generated form letters expressing sympathy without offering action. But in the spring of 2001, Grace received a handwritten envelope that made her heart race. The return address showed only R. Frank with a Portland post office box. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words written in careful script: "Keep digging." Rick Franke had responded. Michael's younger brother, who'd grown up hearing his siblings' dreams of reforming a broken system, was telling her not to give up. Grace read those 2 words dozens of times that first day, then pinned the letter to the bulletin board above her kitchen table. It joined newspaper clippings, photograph copies, and handwritten timelines in a collage of unfinished business. She researched Rick Franke and learned he'd become a journalist after his brother's death, working for small newspapers throughout the Pacific Northwest. His own attempts to investigate Michael's murder had been met with resistance from law enforcement and indifference from editors who considered the case closed. But Keep Digging suggested he hadn't given up either. Somewhere in Portland, another person refused to accept the official story. Someone else knew that Frank Gable's conviction was built on lies and coercion. Grace wrote back immediately, sharing some of her findings and asking if Rick would be willing to meet. The response came 2 weeks. Later, a phone number and 3 words: "Call me Sunday." Their conversation lasted 4 hours. Rick had his own files, his own questions, his own doubts about the investigation. He'd been contacted by Gable's attorneys, who were preparing appeals based on witness recantations and prosecutorial misconduct. "Your son saw something," Rick said near the end of their call. And whoever killed my brother knows he saw it. That's why Jonah had to run. By 2010, Frank Gable had exhausted most of his legal appeals. Grace followed each court filing with growing frustration as judges upheld his conviction despite mounting evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and witness intimidation. The system seemed designed to protect its original narrative rather than pursue truth. When the Oregon Court of Appeals scheduled a hearing for Gable's final appeal, Grace decided to attend. She'd never spoken to the convicted man or his attorneys, but she felt a connection to his struggle. They were both victims of the same cover-up, both fighting an uphill battle against institutional indifference. The courthouse in Salem was the same building where she'd watched Gable's original trial unfold 17 years earlier. Grace took her familiar seat in the back row, notebook ready, hoping against hope that new evidence might finally crack the case open. But the hearing proceeded with predictable efficiency. Prosecutors argued that Gable had received fair representation and that his conviction was based on solid evidence. Defense attorneys presented their case about coerced witnesses and suppressed evidence, but the judges seemed skeptical. When the decision came down 2 weeks later, Grace wasn't surprised by the result. Gable's conviction was reaffirmed. The court acknowledged some irregularities in the original investigation, but concluded they weren't significant enough to overturn the verdict. Grace sat in her car outside the courthouse after hearing the news, hands gripping the steering wheel, until her knuckles turned white. 21 years after Michael Frankie's murder, the official story remained unchanged. Frank Gable would die in prison for a crime she was convinced he didn't commit. As she prepared to drive home, an elderly man approached her car window. She recognized him as Earl Donovan, a former DOC janitor she'd seen around the building during her visits. "Mrs. Halbrook?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I know who you are. I know what you've been trying to do." Grace rolled down her window completely. Earl's hands shook as he leaned closer. "They made him look like a thief," he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But he died for the truth. Your boy knew that. That's why he had to run." Earl reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. A key ring, rusted with age, with a paper tag barely legible in the dim light. "Found this when they renovated the old wing," he whispered. "Been carrying it for 20 years, waiting for the right person to give it to. The tag says M.F. 1989. Grace's hands trembled as she accepted the key ring. Michael Frankie's initials stared back at her, a physical connection to the man whose death had changed everything. "There's more," Earl continued, glancing around nervously. "Things they thought were destroyed. Your boy saved what he could before he ran, hidden it where they'd never think to look." He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand along with the keys. "Storage room in the basement. Old building. East wing. Don't go during the day." Earl stepped back from the car, looking suddenly frail and ancient. "I should have spoken up 20 years ago," he said. "Maybe things would have been different." Grace closed her fist around the keyring, feeling its weight like a promise. "It's not too late," she told him. "It's never too late for the truth." That night, Grace couldn't sleep. The keyring sat on her kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. Michael Frankie's initials, a constant reminder of unfinished business. Earl's directions to the storage room were burned into her memory, but approaching the DOC building after dark felt like crossing a line she'd never uncrossed. By 3 a.m, she'd made her decision. Grace dressed in dark clothes and drove through Salem's empty streets toward the corrections complex. The building loomed against the night sky, most windows dark except for security lighting that cast long shadows across the parking lot. The East Wing was the oldest part of the complex, scheduled for demolition once the new facilities were completed. Grace had walked these corridors during daylight visits, but everything looked different in the darkness. Her flashlight beam swept across peeling paint and water-stained walls as she searched for the basement entrance Earl had described. The keyring felt warm in her palm as she descended concrete steps that echoed with each footfall. The basement smelled of mildew and forgotten bureaucracy, decades of reports and records left to molder in the darkness. Storage room 7B was behind a heavy metal door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Grace tried 3 keys before finding the right one. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if it had been recently oiled. Inside, her flashlight revealed a space filled with filing cabinets and storage boxes, most covered with dust thick enough to write in. But in the back corner, one cabinet stood clean and organized, with folders arranged in careful order. Grace approached it slowly, hardly daring to breathe. The top folder was labeled 1989 Corruption Investigation. In handwriting she recognized immediately Jonah's careful script, unchanged by the years. Her son had been here, recently. Grace's hands shook as she opened the first folder. Inside were documents she'd never seen before, memos, financial records, and witness statements that painted a picture of corruption, reaching the highest levels of Oregon's corrections department. Each page was carefully organized, with notes in the margins written in Jonah's familiar handwriting. But it was the cassette tape at the bottom of the box that stopped her heart. A simple label read, "For Mom," in letters she'd recognize anywhere. Grace carried everything back to her car, her pulse racing with each step. The security guard's rounds had become predictable over the years. She knew she had a 30-minute window before the next patrol. But those 30 minutes felt like hours as she loaded boxes of evidence into her trunk. At home, she spread the documents across her kitchen table like pieces of a massive puzzle. Financial records showed money being diverted from prison budgets into private accounts. Witness statements described intimidation campaigns against employees who asked too many questions. Most damning of all were the meeting minutes from executive sessions where officials discussed managing the Frankie situation. But Grace saved the cassette tape for last. She hadn't owned a tape player in years, but Mrs. Henderson next door still had an old boombox from the 1980 seconds. At 4 in the morning, Grace knocked on her neighbor's door with a story about needing to listen to an old family recording. Back in her kitchen, Grace inserted the tape with trembling fingers and pressed play. Static filled the room for several seconds, then she heard a voice that made her sink into her chair. "Mom, if you're hearing this, it means something happened to me, and Earl found the courage to give you the key." Jonah's voice was older now, deeper, but unmistakably her son's. "I've been watching from a distance for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to come home. I saw who killed Michael Frankie, and I have proof of who covered it up." Grace pressed the tape player against her chest and wept. Jonah's voice continued through her tears. "I was working late that night, filing reports in the Pride basement. I heard voices upstairs, angry voices. When I went to investigate, I saw Warden Holloway and Deputy Director Mercer cornering Mr. Frank in the parking lot. They weren't trying to rob him, they were trying to silence him." Grace wiped her eyes and listened as her son described the murder in devastating detail. How Frankie had threatened to expose kickback schemes and falsified reports. How the two officials had ambushed him after hours, making it look like a botched robbery. How they'd noticed Jonah watching from a window and spent the next weeks hunting for him. "I took copies of everything before I ran," Jonah's recorded voice explained. "Financial records, meeting minutes, correspondence between Holloway and outside contractors. It's all there in the files. I've been adding to the collection over the years, documenting how they covered their tracks and framed Frank Gable." The tape revealed 20 years of patient investigation conducted from the shadows. Jonah had become an expert at remaining invisible, moving from city to city, changing his name, but always keeping Salem and its secrets under surveillance. He'd watched Grace from a distance, proud of her persistence but terrified that approaching her would put her in danger. "They killed one person to protect their crimes," Jonah said near the end of the recording. "They wouldn't hesitate to kill more, but I think enough time has passed. The original conspirators are older now. Some retired, some dead. Maybe it's finally safe to tell the truth." The tape ended with coordinates, a location where Jonah said he'd be waiting if Grace decided to contact law enforcement with the evidence. Grace played the message 3 more times, memorizing every word, every inflection in her son's voice. Then she picked up the phone and called, "Rick Frankie. I found him," she whispered when Rick answered, "and I found the truth." Rick Frank arrived in Salem the next morning, with a journalist named Caleb Maris, whose investigative work had exposed corruption in other state agencies. Grace spread Jonah's evidence across her dining room table, while the two men examined each document with growing amazement. "This is incredible," Caleb said, photographing financial records that showed systematic embezzlement. "These bank statements alone could bring down half the corrections department's leadership." Rick studied meeting minutes from 1989, where officials discussed containment strategies for the Frankie investigation. His brother's murder wasn't a spontaneous crime, it was a calculated assassination, designed to protect millions of dollars in illegal profits. "We need to verify everything," Caleb explained to Grace. "Cross-reference the financial records with state budgets, confirm the authenticity of these internal documents, track down some of these witnesses who might be willing to talk now." Grace understood the process would take time, but she also knew they had advantages the original investigators had lacked. Public records that were sealed in 1989 were now available through Freedom of Information requests. Officials who'd seemed untouchable 20 years ago were now retired and vulnerable to subpoenas. Most importantly, they had Jonah's insider knowledge and meticulous documentation of the cover-up. "What about your son?" Rick asked gently. "The coordinates on the tape, are you ready to see him?" Grace looked at the evidence scattered across her table, then at the phone number Caleb had given her for his editor at the Portland Tribune. The choice was simple. She could reunite with Jonah quietly, and let sleeping dogs lie, or she could use his evidence to expose the truth about Michael Francke's murder. First, we publish the story, she said firmly. Then I bring my son home. Caleb smiled and pulled out his laptop. Then let's bring down some corrupt bastards. The story broke on a Tuesday morning that would change Oregon politics forever. Caleb's investigation ran across 6 full pages of the Portland Tribune, with the headline, Murder, Colorado, Ver, Up, and Corruption. The real story behind the Michael Francke killing. Every major news outlet in the Pacific Northwest was following up. Television reporters camped outside DOC headquarters, demanding comment on the explosive revelations. Radio talk shows buzzed with angry callers who'd suspected the official story all along. Grace watched from her living room as the story spread beyond Oregon's borders. National cable news picked up the scandal, with commentators discussing the implications of high-level corruption in state government. The phrase Oregon cover-up began trending on social media platforms. By evening, Governor Patricia Walsh had announced the formation of a special truth commission to investigate the allegations. Federal prosecutors indicated they were reviewing the evidence for possible charges. The state attorney general promised a thorough examination of the original investigation. Justice delayed is not justice denied, Walsh said during a hastily arranged press conference. If crimes were committed and covered up, those responsible will face consequences regardless of how much time has passed. Grace's phone rang constantly as reporters requested interviews and neighbors called to offer support. Mrs. Henderson appeared at her door with a casserole and tears in her eyes. I always knew you were right, she said, hugging Grace tightly. All these years, you never gave up. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. That evening, Grace stood in her backyard, looking up at the stars, and whispered to the night sky, I'm coming for you, Jonah. It's safe now. The memorial tree at DOC headquarters had grown tall in the years since its planting, but its roots were finally strong enough to support the weight of truth. The Truth Commission hearings began 3 months later, in the same courthouse where Frank Gable had been wrongly convicted. Grace testified on the first day, her voice steady as she described 20 years of searching for answers that powerful people had tried to bury. My son witnessed a murder, she told the packed courtroom. He saw state officials kill Michael Francke to protect their criminal enterprise. For 20 years, he lived in exile while an innocent man rotted in prison for their crime. The evidence Jonah had collected painted a devastating picture of institutional corruption. Financial records showed millions of dollars diverted from prison programs into private accounts. Meeting transcripts revealed plans to frame Gable using coerced testimony from jailhouse informants. Witness statements described a campaign of intimidation against anyone who questioned the official narrative. Warden Victor Halloway, now 73 and long retired, was arrested at his golf club and led away in handcuffs. Deputy Director Clive Mercer, found at his vacation home in Arizona, fought extradition before surrendering to Oregon authorities. During their perp walks, both men maintained stone-faced silence, but their attorneys quickly began negotiating plea agreements as federal prosecutors added RICO charges to the state counts of murder, conspiracy, and corruption. Grace watched from the gallery as her son's carefully preserved evidence dismantled the lies that had defined Salem's recent history. Jonah hadn't just documented a crime, he'd built an airtight case that 20 years of legal maneuvering couldn't weaken. The commission's final report ran over 400 pages and concluded that Michael Francke's murder was a premeditated assassination carried out to prevent exposure of extensive criminal activity within the Oregon Department of Corrections. Frank Gable was posthumously exonerated, his conviction overturned with the court's formal apology to his family. Justice had finally arrived, gray-haired and walking with a cane, but undeniably real. Frank Gable had died in prison 2 years earlier, still maintaining his innocence to the end. Grace attended the ceremony where the court formally cleared his name, reading a statement from his sister thanking everyone who'd fought to expose the truth. Frank never gave up hope that someday people would know he didn't kill Michael Francke, the sister said through tears. He would have been proud to see justice finally served, even though it came too late to save him. Grace placed flowers on both Gable's grave and Francke's memorial, 2 men who'd been destroyed by the same corruption in different ways. The cemetery was quiet, except for the wind rustling through old oak trees that had witnessed Salem's transformation from innocent community to crime scene to healing ground. Caleb Maris won a Pulitzer Prize for his investigation, but he deflected credit to Grace and Jonah during every interview. Rick Francke established a foundation dedicated to preventing wrongful convictions, using his brother's name to fight for future innocence. The Truth Commission's recommendations led to sweeping reforms in Oregon's criminal justice system. New protocols for evidence preservation, mandatory recording of interrogations, and independent oversight of prosecutorial conduct were implemented statewide. But for Grace, the most important change was simpler and more personal. After 20 years of setting two places at her dinner table, she finally had reason to believe both chairs might be filled again. She'd kept her promise to keep searching. She'd honored Jonah's courage and Michael Francke's sacrifice. She'd refused to let powerful people bury the truth along with their victims. The coordinates from Jonah's tape led to a small town in Northern California, where her son was waiting under an assumed name, ready to come home once the danger had passed. Grace had learned his phone number but hadn't called yet. Some conversations were too important for telephone wires. The memorial service for Michael Francke was held on the 22nd anniversary of his murder, but this time, it was a celebration of vindication rather than mourning. His family planted a new tree on the DOC grounds, an oak sapling that would grow strong roots in honest soil. Grace stood with Rick Francke as they watched workers install a bronze plaque beneath the young tree. The inscription read simply, Michael Francke, 1947-1989. He died fighting corruption. His death exposed it. Your son's evidence saved Michael's reputation, Rick told Grace as they watched the ceremony. My brother died believing he'd failed to clean up the system. Now everyone knows he died because he was succeeding. Grace touched the bark of the memorial tree, thinking about growth that happens slowly, roots that spread invisibly until they're strong enough to support something beautiful. Truth worked the same way, buried for years, then suddenly breaking through into sunlight. She knelt beside the tree and tucked something among its roots. Jonah's high school graduation photo, the one she'd carried for 20 years. Her son's young face smiled up from beneath the soil, finally at peace, in the place where his courage had planted seeds of justice. Come home, she whispered to the photograph. It's safe now. The wind stirred the oak's new leaves, and for the first time in decades, Grace felt hope without reservation. Salem could heal now that its infected wound had been cleaned. Families could rebuild now that truth had been restored. The memorial tree would grow tall and strong, its branches reaching toward sky that no longer held the weight of buried secrets. And somewhere in California, her son was packing his bags for the journey home. Several months later, Grace sat on her front porch in the gathering dusk, watching the street where she'd raised her son and mourned his absence. The neighborhood looked the same as it had 20 years ago, but everything felt different now. Secrets had a way of poisoning the air, and their absence left everything cleaner and brighter. A car turned onto her street just as the streetlights flickered on. Grace recognized the Honda Civic from the DMV records. Caleb had shown her registered to James Harrison, the name Jonah had been using in California. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the car slowed, then stopped in front of her house. The man who got out was both stranger and son. Taller than she remembered, thinner, with silver threading through hair that had been brown when he'd kissed her goodbye. But his eyes were the same kind and worried and searching her face for signs of forgiveness. Jonah stood at the end of her walkway for a long moment, as if afraid to come closer. Grace understood his hesitation. 20 years was a long time to carry guilt and fear. He'd been barely more than a boy when he'd fled. He was returning as a middle-aged man who'd lived most of his adult life in exile. Mom? His voice cracked on the word, and Grace was off her porch before she realized she was moving. She pulled him into her arms the way she'd dreamed of doing 10,000 times, and he collapsed against her like a child who'd finally found safety after being lost in the woods. They stood in her front yard holding each other while neighbors peeked through curtains, and the memorial tree at DOC headquarters rustled in the evening breeze. Is it really over? Jonah whispered against her shoulder. Grace tightened her arms around her son and smiled through her tears. It's really over, she said. Welcome home.